Good afternoon. I'm Steve Shalom. I'm the director of the Gandhian Forum for Peace and Justice, and I teach in the Political Science Department. The Gandhian Forum is proud to be sponsoring today's program, but because people all across the campus share our view that hosting Chris Hedges is so important, we have many co-sponsors. So I'd like to thank the Asian Studies Program, the Latin American and Latino Studies Program, the Race and Gender Project, the Departments of Anthropology, Communication, English, History, Political Science, and Sociology, the College of Humanities and Social Science, the Cotsakos College of Business, and the Office of the Provost. Our speaker, Chris Hedges, was one of the most distinguished foreign correspondents in the United States. He reported from more than 50 countries and for nearly 2 decades covered wars in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. In 2002, he shared journalism's most coveted award, the Pulitzer Prize, for his reporting on terrorism. That same year, Amnesty International gave him its Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. But then in May 2003, he gave a graduation speech at Rockford College in which he warned that the occupation of Iraq was likely to be, quote, damaging to our souls. When the New York Times, for whom he worked, reprimanded him for his remarks and told him to stop talking about the war, Hedges quit the Times, and the preeminent war correspondent became a preeminent critic of war. His book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, was a finalist for a National Book Critics Circle Award. And in so many other books, and then as a columnist for the website Truthdig, he's become one of our most astute and powerful voices for social justice. So, without further ado, I present to you Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much, and I first want to congratulate those students who stood up for the cafeteria workers. That shows that you have grasped the most important quality of a liberal arts education, and that is the capacity for moral autonomy. The first piece of journalism I wrote was for my high school newspaper. I was given a scholarship to a boarding school in Connecticut, and the extremely wealthy school in which the Rockefellers had attended, heavily endowed with millions of dollars, a campus that rivaled that of small colleges. And yet the people who worked in the kitchen help, were treated very shabbily. They lived in appalling conditions up over the dining hall, where students were, of course, banned from visiting. I went up there and saw the single bare light bulbs and cots and broken facilities in the lavatory, no shower head, and waited until the commencement issue when all the rich alumni and rich parents would attend to write an expose on how this incredibly wealthy school treated the people who worked there. And when I came, it caused, of course, great embarrassment to the school, something which delighted me no end. And that summer, they rebuilt the entire facilities for the kitchen help. And when I came back, at their own expense, the workers in the kitchen had put a plaque up in their dormitory in my honor. And to this day, that remains one of the proudest moments of my journalistic career, and one that taught me that the role of journalism, true journalism, is to speak and give a voice to those people who without you would have no voice. And so I am proud to be here today, proud to be in a room. I know that there are people in this room who carried out that activity. I applaud you for it. I hope it launches you on a life of activism and a life of meaning, a life where you don't spend your time and your career building pathetic monuments to yourself, either monuments of power or monuments of money. I was asked when I came to speak a little bit about the legacy of Martin Luther King before I talked about war, which I am more than happy to do. I'm a great admirer of King. I'm also a great admirer of Malcolm X. And I think that one can't understand King if they don't understand Malcolm X. These, to my mind, were two of our greatest religious prophets, both of whom understood aspects of the African American experience that finally melded and meshed at the end of their lifetimes. David Halberstam interviewed Martin Luther King just a few months before he was assassinated and said that he sounds like a nonviolent Malcolm X, although, of course, Malcolm X was a nonviolent Malcolm X. And for those of us who come steeped in the tradition of radical politics, one of the things that has been most discouraging is to see one of America's greatest intellectuals, greatest radicals, and greatest moral figures turned into a red, white, and blue icon. King has been frozen in 1963 with his I Have a Dream speech, and this, of course, is not uncommon with great social reformers. They are kidnapped by power elites who, of course, oppose them in their lifetime and turned into harmless props of American glory. Let us not forget that King was a socialist. He understood that our permanent war economy was intimately intertwined with the poverty and the disenfranchisement of our poor, and especially, of course, of African Americans. We forget that shortly after the Selma March and the riots in Watts, King said, "They have turned my dream into a nightmare." We forget that King preached that love cannot be separated from justice, that for King, justice defines love, that they are intricately interwoven, and that direct action in civil disobedience in the face of injustice is for King a political expression of love because it heals society. It exposes wounds, it exposes hurt, and that, in a small way, is precisely what those of you who stood up for these cafeteria workers did here at William Patterson. Now, this accent on justice for the poor and against war is precisely what mainstream society is attempting to separate from King's understanding of love. But for King, and I think for Malcolm, justice and love can never be separated. Malcolm has never been made palatable for the white mainstream, and it has been impossible for them to turn him into an establishment icon. But I want to talk for a few minutes about the legacy and importance of Malcolm X. He certainly influenced King as deeply as King, in the end, influenced him, because both grasped that at the end of their lives that racism comes in a multitude of forms. King grew up in the upper middle class, son of a prominent Baptist preacher. He wanted for nothing, certainly a segregated community, but economically King did very well. Even King writes that until his early 20s, life for him came wrapped up, he said, like a Christmas present. And King, while certainly profoundly aware of systems of economic injustice, believed in the goodness of the white mainstream through integration to abolish racism. Malcolm's experience as an African American was markedly different. He was thrust into a series of foster homes where he was abused, never finished school beyond the 8th grade, hustled on the streets of Roxbury, later Harlem, spent years in prison. For Malcolm, it wasn't an issue of integration. Northern blacks could legally sit at a Woolworth counter next to a white man. But of course, as Malcolm understood, they could not afford to eat. That Northern racism, and that was something that King grasped when he finally came to Chicago, was as insidious and as entrenched as Southern racism, but manifested itself in a different form. Malcolm understood that the white people he encountered, primarily the police, the prison authorities, court officials, probation officers, lacked both a conscience and compassion. And his words reflected that reality, a reality that King, I think, only came to grasp and articulate in the latter part of his life. "I'm not an American," Malcolm said. "I'm one of 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism, one of the victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy. So I'm not standing here speaking to you as an American or a patriot or a flag saluter or a flag waver. No, not I. I'm speaking as a victim of this American system, and I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare." King, after Chicago, began to sound more and more like Malcolm. He soon began telling Christian that any religion that professes to be concerned with the souls of men and is not concerned with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that cripple them, is a spiritually moribund religion in need of new blood. And King, near the end of his life, began to refer to most whites in America as, and these are his words, unconscious racists. "There aren't enough white people in our country," King said, "who are willing to cherish democratic principles over privilege." The cruder forms of racist rhetoric are now, of course, considered impolite in American society, and they use King to pretend that we have attained equality and equal opportunity, while ignoring the fact that for the bottom 2/3 of African Americans in this country, things are worse than they were when King and Malcolm were alive. I just spent several weeks in Camden, New Jersey, writing a story for Harper's Magazine that will be out in April. Camden, per capita, is the poorest city in the country. It is also ranked the most dangerous city in the country. It is a colony. Those are Malcolm's words, and those became King's words. It is a colony of the disenfranchised, trapped in an urban ghetto, and when they attempt to rise, of course, shuttled into our huge prison industrial complex, where a staggering 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 are now incarcerated. There are more African American men in America today behind bars than there are in college. The cell block, the poet Yusuf Kumunyaka writes, has replaced the auction block. And the fact that prisons and urban ghettos are populated by people of color, only 1% of the population in Camden is Caucasian, is a calculated decision by those in the white mainstream who wield economic and political control. In the last months of his life, King began to appropriate Malcolm's very terms, calling the ghetto a system of internal colonism. The purpose of the slum, King said, is to confine those who have no power and perpetuate their powerlessness. The slum is little more than a domestic colony which leaves its inhabitants dominated politically, exploited economically, segregated, and humiliated at every turn. The chief problem, King understood, is economic, and the solution is to restructure the entire society, which is, of course, why King was a socialist. The kind of genocide has been perpetuated against black people, King said just a few weeks before he died. Not physical genocide, but psychological and spiritual genocide. An onslaught that has not been comprehended in earlier years when we had not evaluated the depth of resistance in the white community to real equality. When hope diminishes, the hate element is often turned toward those who originally build up the hope, King observed. The bitterness is often greater toward that person who built up the hope, who could say, I have a dream, but couldn't produce the dream because of the failure and the sickness of the nation to respond to the dream. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as both King and Malcolm understood, are empty words if there is no possibility for a decent education, a safe neighborhood, a job with a living wage. And both King and Malcolm grasped that the vast expenditures, 60% of all discretionary spending by the federal government, $1 trillion in defense-related commitments, and our imperial expansion are intimately linked to the perpetuation of racism and poverty at home. In King's speech on April 4th at Riverside Church, which he titled Beyond Vietnam, a year before he died, King called America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, a quote that you won't see in many Martin Luther King Day celebrations. He told his staff shortly before that speech, we must see now that the evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are all tied together. You really can't get rid of one without getting rid of the others. Part of my great admiration for both King and Malcolm is that they had such deep integrity that they were willing, for principle and because of their moral autonomy, to stand even against their own. King's decision to denounce the Vietnam War, to condemn economic structures which perpetuated poverty and insidious, institutionalized forms of racism, saw many white liberals, members of his own staff, and allies within the political structure in the Johnson White House turn against him. And in their final days, both King and Malcolm were very isolated and lonely figures. But these prophets, as all prophets do, spoke on behalf of people who had nothing left with which to compromise. And for this reason, they refused to compromise. You can't drive a knife into a man's back 9 inches, pull it out 6 inches, and call it progress, Malcolm said. I've decided what I'm going to do, King preached at one of his last sermons at Ebenezer Baptist Church. I ain't going to kill nobody in Mississippi and in Vietnam. I ain't going to study war no more. And you know what? I don't care who doesn't like what I say about it. I don't care who criticizes me in an editorial. I don't care what white person or Negro criticizes me. I'm going to stick with the best. On some positions, cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when a true follower of Jesus Christ must make a stand that's neither safe, nor politic, nor popular. But he must take that stand because it is right. Every now and then we sing about it. If you are right, God will fight your battle. I'm going to stick by the best during these evil times. I grew up in a farm town in upstate New York, a rural, white enclave where in the early 1960s, Martin Luther King was one of the most hated men in America. My father, a Presbyterian minister, took us to civil rights marches even as children. He was a veteran, a sergeant in the Second World War in North Africa, and from his pulpit denounced the conflict in Vietnam. He told me when I was 10 or 11 that if the war was still being fought and I was drafted, he would go to prison with me. And to this day, I carry an image of sitting in a jail cell with my dad. Finally, my father was an outspoken advocate for gay and lesbian rights. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay, lived with his partner in Greenwich Village, and my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. When I went to college at Colgate University in upstate New York, my father by then had a church in Syracuse an hour away. He found that there was no gay and lesbian organization at Colgate, and so he brought the gay speakers to campus. And I, who was certainly one of the most committed heterosexuals at Colgate, would join these discussions with my dad and gay activists and other students, speaking about other ways of being and believing, about mutual respect and dignity. And this led to gay and lesbian students confiding in my father that they were uncomfortable coming out of the closet to form an organization, a public organization, a dilemma that my dad solved by driving down one day and taking me to lunch and telling me that I had to found it. So I founded the Gay and Lesbian Alliance at Colgate University. I never attended, but it had my name on it. And when I would go into the dining hall for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, the checker would take my card, check off the appropriate box, and hand it back to me and say, "Faggot." So I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend. I went to war. I went to El Salvador as a freelance reporter in the early 1980s. I went as an idealist. I went as someone who had been deeply influenced by George Orwell, who felt that the role of a journalist was to stand on the other side of the divide. When I got to El Salvador, between 800 and 1,000 people were being killed every month by the death squads. And what I didn't understand was the powerful attraction that violence can wield, even for those who go to war for supposedly noble or just reasons. My first experience with an ambush was in a small mud and wattle town in central El Salvador called Suchitoto. The FMLN rebels had surrounded and mounted an assault on the town. There was a small military garrison in the center. They had cut off all the roads into the town and were besieging this garrison when I and the other journalists appeared on that dirt strip into Suchitoto. We stopped at the bridge where the photographers and camera people who have to stand in firefights, unlike the print reporters, got high. And then we made our way up through that tall grass into Suchitoto until we ran into a rebel unit, by now accustomed to the follies of the international press, and we proceeded with that unit up to the few yards from within the military garrison that was under siege. As I rounded a corner, a full burst of automatic fire rent the air. The rebel unit I was with began to, of course, fire from their M16s. The scent of cordite filled the air. One rebel was shot and fell wounded, crying out in a sad cadence for his mother. I hit the dirt, crawled back behind a wall, eventually was able to flee to safety and leave that village. However fearful that moment was, and it was fearful, at the same time it was deeply exhilarating. Soldiers and Marines call it a combat high, that burst of adrenaline, that Zen-like experience where you are present in a way that you never were before. Even colors are brighter. And when I got back to San Salvador, with the other correspondents and photographers, I drank away the fear in a seedy bar in downtown San Salvador. Most people, after an experience like that, would learn to stay away. I was hooked. I spent 5 years in El Salvador, 7 years in the Middle East, and then went to cover the war in the former Yugoslavia, being based in Sarajevo. That rush of adrenaline, those constant bursts of a combat high, turns violence, war, into a drug. Indeed, war is the most powerful narcotic invented by humankind. And like any narcotic, it perverts you, corrupts you, and destroys you, both physically and finally emotionally. Cuts you off from the world of the living. It is why after a conflict would end, all of us as the fraternity of war correspondents would gather to seek the next conflict that we would cover. It is why when I was covering the war in Kosovo, I was doing so with people who I had worked with 20 years earlier before in El Salvador. War is the pornography of violence. It has a dark beauty filled with the monstrous and the grotesque. The Bible calls it the lust of the eye and warns believers against it. It gives us a distorted sense of self. It gives us meaning. It creates a feeling of comradeship that obliterates our alienation and makes us feel, for perhaps the first time in our lives, that we belong. War allows us to rise above our small stations in life. We find nobility in the cause, feelings of selflessness, even bliss. And once in a conflict, the shallowness of much of our life becomes apparent. A fruitless search to find fulfillment and meaning in the acquisition of things and wealth and power is laid bare. The trivia that dominates our airwaves is exposed as empty chatter. War permits us to engage in lusts and passions that we keep hidden in the deepest, most private interiors of our fantasy life. It permits us to destroy not only things, but human beings. And in that moment of wholesale destruction, we believe we wield the power of the divine, the power to revoke another person's charter to live on this earth. The frenzy of this destruction, and when unit discipline breaks down, or there was no unit discipline to begin with, frenzy is the right word, sees armed bands crazed by the poisonous elixir, our power to bring about the obliteration of others delivers. All things, including human beings, become objects to either gratify or destroy or both, and almost no one is immune. The contagion of the crowd sees to that. Force, Simon Weil writes, is as pitiless to the man who possesses it or thinks he does as it is to its victims. The second, it crushes. The first, it intoxicates. And those who have the least meaning in their lives, the impoverished Palestinians in Gaza, the disenfranchised North African immigrants in France, Even the legions of youth in the splendid indolence and safety of the industrialized world are all susceptible to war's appeal. I do not miss war, but I miss what it brought. I could never say I was happy in the fighting in El Salvador or Bosnia or Kosovo, but I had a sense of purpose, and this is a quality war shares with love, for we are also able to choose fealty and self-sacrifice over security for those we love. This is why war at its inception always looks and feels like love, the chief emotion that war destroys. We feel in wartime comradeship, and we confuse this with friendship, with love. There are those who will insist that the comradeship formed in war is love, the ecstatic glow that makes us feel as one people, one entity is real. But this is only part of war's intoxication. As this feeling dissipates, there is always a nostalgia for its warm glow. Wartime always brings with it this comradeship, which is the opposite of friendship. Friends, as J. Glenn Gray points out, are predetermined. Friendship takes place between men and women who possess an intellectual and emotional affinity for each other. And many of us will admit that we never really had a friend, and even the most fortunate of us have very few. But comradeship, that ecstatic bliss that comes with belonging to the crowd, is within our reach. We can all have comrades. The danger, the external threat that comes when we have an enemy, does not create friendship. It creates comradeship, and those in wartime, those nations at war, are deceived about what they are undergoing. This is why once the war ends, these comrades again become strangers to us. This is why after war, we fall into despair. In friendship, there is a deepening of our sense of self. We become, through the friend, more aware of who we are, of what we are about. We find ourselves in the eyes of the friend. Friends probe and question and challenge us to make each more complete. They draw the secrets out of us and know our inner core of being. For we reach and we change others, and we are changed. When we plunge to the depths of our inner life, the depths that expose our insecurities, our incompleteness, those depths that often lie beyond articulation. And comradeship, the kind that comes to us in patriotic fervor, there is a suppression of self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-possession. Comrades lose their identities in wartime for the collective rush of a common cause, a common purpose. In comradeship, life is ecstatic and corporate, as opposed to friendship, where life is singular and individual. In comradeship, there are no demands on the self. Comradeship allows us to escape the demands on the self that is always part of friendship. And that is why once the danger is past, once war is over, these feelings are extinguished. In wartime, when we feel threatened, we no longer face death alone, but as a group. and this makes death easier to bear. We ennoble self-sacrifice for the other, for the comrade. In short, in war, we begin to worship death. And this is what the God of war demands from us. Think of what it means to die for a friend. It is deliberate and painful. There is no ecstasy. For friends, dying is hard and bitter. The dialogue they have and cherish will perhaps never be recreated. Friends do not, the way comrades do, love death and sacrifice. To friends, the prospect of death is frightening. And this is why friendship, or let me say love, is the most potent enemy of war. The reports from Iraq and Afghanistan paint a picture of a war that has a coherency and logic that it does not possess in battle. We taste a bit of war's exhilaration in the images, but are safe. And as with all wars, these come with manufactured heroes and feel-good stories about our own and an enemy that is always painted as barbaric and uncivilized. It is possible to thrill in the perversity of war, even as we watch films or read books that are meant to denounce war. You cannot produce anti-war films or books or documentaries that present images of battle. It is like trying to condemn pornography while showing erotic love scenes. Vietnam War films are all pro-war, writes my friend Tony Swafford in Jarhead, his memoir of the First Persian Gulf War. No matter what the supposed message, what Kubrick or Coppola or Stone intended. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson in Omaha or San Francisco or Manhattan will watch the films and weep and decide once and for all that war is inhumane and terrible. They will tell their friends at church and their family this. But Corporal Johnson at Camp Pendleton and Sergeant Johnson at Travis Air Force Base and Seaman Johnson at Coronado Naval Station and Specialist 4 Johnson at Fort Bragg and Lance Corporal Swafford at 29 Palms Marine Corps Base watch the same films and are excited by them because the magic brutality of the films celebrate the terrible and despicable beauty of their fighting skills. Fight, rape, war, pillage, burn. Filmic images of death and carnage are pornographic for the military man. With film, you are stroking his cock, tickling his balls with the pink feather of history, getting him ready for his real first fuck. It doesn't matter how many Mr. and Mrs. Johnsons are anti-war, the actual killers who know how to use the weapons are not. War is part of the modern industrial landscape. Indeed, its tools are often the cutting edge of technology. By World War I, we had created ways in which thousands of people who never saw their attackers could die in an instant. Weapons that carry out this impersonal mass slaughter are beautiful. They are crafted, sleek, and harbor within them awesome power. The machines of war, the planes, the tanks, the heavy machine guns, the huge hulking howitzers, and the helicopters are pieces of art. I have seen them at work. They are angels of death streaking through the sky. Drawn into a world of war, it becomes hard to escape. It pushes you closer and closer to your own annihilation spiritual, emotional, and finally physical. It destroys the continuity of life. It tears apart all systems of life, economic, social, environmental, and political, all systems that sustain us as a human species. War, the essence of war, is death. By the end of the war in El Salvador, I had a nervous twitch in my face. I was evacuated 3 times by the U.S. Embassy because of tips that the death squads planned to kill me, and yet each time I came back. I accepted with a grim fatalism that I would die in El Salvador. I could not articulate why I accepted my own destruction and cannot now. There came to be a part of me, maybe it is a part of all of us, which decided I would rather die like this than return to the dull routine. During the war in El Salvador, I worked with a photographer who had a slew of close calls and then called it quits. He moved to Miami for Newsweek. But life in Florida was flat, dull, uninteresting. He could not adjust, and he soon came back. From the moment he stepped off the plane, it was clear he had returned to die. And just as there are some soldiers or war correspondents who seem to us immortal, and whose loss comes as a sobering reminder that death has no favorites, there are also those in war who are locked in a grim embrace with death from which they cannot escape. My friend was frightening to behold, a walking corpse. He was shot through the back in a firefight and died in less than a minute. Sigmund Freud divided the forces in human nature between the eros, instinct, the impulse within us that propels us to become close to others, to preserve and conserve, to protect life, and the thanatos, or death instinct, the impulse that works towards the annihilation of all living things, including ourselves. For Freud, these 2 forces were in eternal conflict, and for this reason he was pessimistic about eradicating war. All human history, he argued, in civilization and its discontents, is a tug of war between these 2 instincts. Taste enough of war and you come to believe the Stoics were right. We will, in the end, all consume ourselves in a vast conflagration. In war, we deform ourselves, our essence. We give up individual conscience, maybe even consciousness, for the contagion of the crowd, the rush of patriotism, the belief that we must stand together as a nation in moments of extremity. To make a moral choice, to defy war's enticement, can be self-destructive, but in the rise to power, we always become smaller. Power absorbs us, and once power is obtained, we are its pawn. As in Shakespeare's Richard III, the all-powerful prince who molded the world, we fall prey to the forces we thought we had harnessed. Love may not always triumph, but it keeps us human. It offers the only chance to escape from the contagion of war, and perhaps it is the only antidote. And there are times when remaining human is the only victory possible. When the mask of war slips away, when the rot and corruption is uncovered, when it turns sour and rank, when the myth is exposed as a fraud, we feel soiled and spent. It is then that we sink into despair. During the war in El Salvador, soldiers could serve in the army for 3 or 4 years or longer, virtually until they psychologically or physically collapsed. In garrison towns, commanders banned the sale of sedatives because of the heavy abuse by troops. In this war, the emotionally maimed were common. I interviewed a 19-year-old Salvadoran army sergeant who had spent 5 years fighting and suddenly lost his vision after his unit walked into an ambush. The rebels killed 11 soldiers in the firefight, including his closest friend. A couple dozen soldiers were wounded. He was unable to see again until he was placed in the army hospital. I have these horrible headaches, he told me, sitting on the edge of his bed. There is shrapnel in my head. I keep telling the doctors to take it out. But the doctors told me he had no head wounds. I saw other soldiers in other conflicts go deaf or stop speaking or simply shake without being able to stop. War is necrophilia. This necrophilia is central to soldiering just as it is central to the makeup of suicide bombers and terrorists. The necrophilia is hidden under platitudes about duty or comradeship. It waits especially in moments when we seem to have little to live for and no hope, or in moments when the intoxication of war is at its pitch to be unleashed. And when we spend long enough in war, it comes to us as a kind of release, a fatal and seductive embrace that can consummate the long flirtation with our own destruction. War ascendant wipes out eros. It wipes out delicacy and tenderness. Its communal power renders the individual obsolete. To hand all passions, all moral choice to the crowd. When we see this, when we see our addiction for what it is, when we understand ourselves and how war has perverted us, life becomes hard to bear. John Steele, a cameraman I worked with in Sarajevo, had a nervous breakdown when he returned to London in Heathrow Airport. He understood the reality of his work, a reality that stripped away the self-righteous, high-octane gloss. I came back from Sarajevo, he told me. We were in a place called Sniper's Alley. I filmed a girl there who had been hit in the neck by a sniper's bullet. I filmed her in the ambulance, and only after she was dead, I suddenly understood that the last thing she had seen was the reflection of the lens of the camera I was holding in front of her. That wiped me out. I grabbed the camera and started running down Sniper's Alley, filming at knee level the Bosnians running from place to place. A year after the war in Sarajevo, I sat with Bosnian friends who had suffered horribly. A young woman, Liliana, had lost her father, a Serb, who refused to join the besieging Serb forces around the city. She had been forced a few days earlier to identify his corpse. The body was lifted, the water running out of the sides of a rotting coffin from a small park for reburial in the central cemetery. She was emigrating for Australia soon, where she told me, "I will marry a man who has never heard of this war and raise my children, and they will be told nothing about it, nothing about the country I am from." Liliana was young, but the war had exacted a toll. Her cheeks were hollow, her hair dry and brittle, her teeth were decayed, and some had broken into jagged bits. She had no money for a dentist. She hoped to fix them in Australia. Yet all she and her friends did that afternoon was lament the days when they lived in fear and hunger, emaciated, targeted by Serb gunners on the heights above. They did not wish back the suffering, and yet they admitted these may have been the fullest days of their lives. They looked at me in despair. I knew them when they were being pounded by hundreds of shells a day, when they had no water to bathe in or wash their clothes, when they huddled in unheated apartments as sniper bullets hit the walls outside. But what they expressed was real. It was the disillusionment with a sterile, futile, and empty present. Peace had again peeled back the void that the rush of war, of battle, had filled. Once again they were, as perhaps we all are, alone, no longer bound by a common struggle, no longer given the opportunity to be noble, heroic, no longer sure of what life was about or what it meant. The old comradeship, however false, had vanished with the last shot. Moreover, they had seen that all the sacrifice had been for naught. They had been, as we all are in war, betrayed. The corrupt old Communist Party bosses who became nationalists overnight and got them into the mess in the first place had grown rich off their suffering and were still in power. There was a 70% unemployment rate. They depended on handouts from the international community. They understood that their cause, once as fashionable in certain intellectual circles as they were themselves, lay forgotten. No longer did actors, politicians, and artists scramble to visit during the ceasefires, acts that were almost always ones of gross self-promotion. They knew the lie of war, the mockery of their idealism, and struggled with their shattered illusions, and yet they wished it all back. And I did too. A year later, I received a Christmas card. It was signed, Liliana from Australia. It had no return address. I never heard from her again. But many of those I worked with as war correspondents during the past 20 years did not escape. They could not break free from the dance with death. They wandered from conflict to conflict, seeking always one more hit. By then I was back in Gaza and found myself pinned down in another ambush. A young Palestinian 15 feet away was shot through the chest and killed. I had been lured back, but now felt none of the old rush, just fear. It was time to break free, to let go, to accept that none of this would or could or should return. I knew it was over. I was lucky to get out alive. Kurt Schork, brilliant, courageous, driven, could not let go. He died in an ambush in Sierra Leone, along with another friend, Gil Moreno. His entrapment, his embrace of Thanatos, of the death instinct, was never mentioned in the sterile and antiseptic memorial service staged for him in Washington. Everyone tiptoed around it. But for those of us who knew him, we understood that he had been consumed. I had worked with Kurt for 10 years, starting in northern Iraq, literate, funny. It seems the brave are often funny. He and I passed books back and forth in our struggle to make sense of the madness around us. His loss is a hole that will never be filled. His ashes were placed in the Lion Cemetery in Sarajevo for the victims of the war. I flew to Sarajevo and met the British filmmaker Dan Reed. It was an overcast November day. We stood over the grave and downed a pint of whiskey. Dan lit a candle. I recited a poem the Roman lyric poet Catullus had written to honor his dead brother. By strangers' coasts and waters, many days at sea, I come here for the rites of your unworlding, bringing for you, the dead, these last gifts of the living, and my words, vain sounds for a man of dust. Alas, my brother, you have been taken from me. You have been taken from me, and by cold chance turned a shadow and my pain. Here are the foods of the old ceremony, appointed long ago for the starvelings under the earth. Take them. Your brother's tears have made them wet. And take into eternity my hail and my farewell. It was there, among 4,000 war dead, that Kurt belonged. He died because he could not free himself from war. He was trying to replicate what he had found in Sarajevo, but he could not. War could never be new again. Kurt had been in East Timor and Chechnya. Sierra Leone, I was sure, meant nothing to him. Kurt and Miguel could not let go. They would be the first to admit it. Spend long enough at war, and you cannot fit in anywhere else. It finally kills you. It is not a new story. It starts out like love, but it is death. War is the beautiful young nymph in the fairy tale that, when kissed, exhales the vapors of the underworld. The ancient Greeks had a word for such a fate: ekpyrosis. It means to be consumed by a ball of fire, and they used it to describe heroes. Thank you very much.